All right, thank you so much for your time here on our show, Insight Today.
Glad to be here.
Well, we saw quite a start to April, not on top of just the elections here in Korea, but April 13th, North Korea actually launched its long-range rocket. Now, ultimately, it is being deemed a failure, but first of all, would you tell us a little bit about not only South Korea's response, but the international community as well?
Well, South Korea, the United States, and Japan spoke with one voice in condemning very strongly this provocation. China and Russia also criticized the rocket launch, but they also asked that all parties remain calm and reasonable in this situation. Nobody was really fooled by the North Korean claim that this rocket launch was a peaceful space exploration. All the major powers recognized that the technology needed to launch a rocket into space is essentially the same technology as launching a ballistic missile at another country.
Speaking of major powers, let's talk about the UN Security Council. We saw the United States and China sign the UN Security Council contract. A lot of people were surprised at how quickly China was on board with this, being, its close ties with North Korea.
Yes, well, the final statement actually presidential statement has not been completed, but yes, the Chinese went right along with the idea. There was a release a few days ago condemning the launch and calling for North Korea to abide by all previous UN Security Council resolutions and to stop missile testing and to denuclearize, as has been demanded by the Security Council before. And China and Russia both, who have been reluctant sometimes to go along with the Western powers, agreed to this.
Well, of course, the rocket launch itself is significant, but now all eyes are focusing on the repercussions of it. Let's start off here in South Korea. We have the military in emergency mode trying to find the remains of the rocket. Now, if we were able to find this, couldn't we use it to assess how far along North Korea's technology is?
Absolutely, depending on exactly what you found.
Right.
But anything would be useful to one degree or another. However, they haven't, as far as I know, nothing's been found yet. And just like in a search for missing people in a disaster area or whatever, the longer that it goes on and nothing is found, the less likely it is that anything will be found.
Where do you stand in your optimism regarding the finding of it?
I think it's unlikely at this point.
Well, we have not only of course, the rocket launch and the finding of the rocket remains and whatnot, but also all eyes being focused on where the Sixparty nuclear talks stand. What are your takes on the resumption of these talks starting up again?
I think it's very unlikely in the next few months that the talks will start up again. Under normal circumstances, neither South Korea nor the United States would be eager to go back to the talks so soon after a North Korean provocation of this magnitude. But it's not normal circumstances. South Korea has a presidential election this year. The United States has a presidential election this year. And I don't think in either country, either the sitting president nor any of the candidates would really endorse going to the Six-Party talks in this climate. And on the other side, you also have a difficulty. Kim Jong-un has only recently taken power, and he's still consolidating his regime, his hold on power. So I don't think it's likely that the North Korean government is in a position to make any major concessions anyway. So I think the various parties will continue to talk to each other outside of the framework of the Six-Party talks, bilateral, trilateral kinds of discussions. But I don't think a formal meeting of the Six-Party talks is likely this year.
Let's talk about North Korea's leadership there then. I mean, being that this was a big step in terms of North Korea admitting that this rocket launch was a failure, being that this was not the first rocket launch, but it is the first time it had submitted such a thing. What is the significance behind this?
Behind the admission?
Right.
Well, they made such a big deal of this being part of the 100th birthday of Kim Il-sung and the ceremonies and celebrations that go along with that. There was so much publicity around it that even in North Korea, I think people would have wondered what was going on if they hadn't announced the outcome of the launch.
So would you even see this as a setback for the regime of Kim Jong-un?
It's clearly a setback. He's a new and untested leader, and for a major failure like this to happen so early in his reign is not good for him. On the other hand, I don't think we should overestimate the significance of this. I think the regime is stable.
Okay. Well, being, like you mentioned, the centennial birthday of Kim Il-sung, they had mass military parades and whatnot. There were a couple significant things. Number one being, during the parade, some people are saying that there was what looked like a long-range rocket actually in the background of it. What are experts analyzing North Korea's technology level as of now?
Well, one of the things that was noted about the rocket is it seemed to be mobile.
Right.
Historically, Korean long-range rockets have been fixed. Mobile rockets means that they can be moved around, which means they're much harder to target. You don't know where they are, so you can't target them in advance. North Korea is very advanced in short-range missiles. They have been successful in selling components and even entire missile systems overseas. It's a major export of theirs. However, long-range missiles that North Korea has are notoriously unreliable and inaccurate. So there's a considerable difference between their capability of launching short-range missiles and their capability in long-range missiles at this time. Of course, that's what they're working on. That's what these tests are about.
Exactly.
But at this time, their long-range capabilities are relatively weak.
Okay. Well, another significant point is that we heard Kim Jong-un's voice for the first time. He did make a speech there. This is very different from Kim Jong-il. Would you say that he's maybe trying to go more towards his grandfather Kim Il-sung's approach in leadership?
I'm not sure that we can draw that conclusion
Just
from a
that
single
one
speech. Again, this is a very historic moment to the North Koreans, the 100th anniversary of the dear leader, the great leader, I'm sorry. I think that it was very important for the succession process for Kim Jong-un to appear in public at this moment. I don't know whether he's going to make a practice of it or not.
Right. Being that so little is known on this young leader, every little move, every different move is being assessed quite in detail, isn't it?
Well, it is, but there's really not much to go on yet.
Exactly. Well, let's talk a little bit about this cycle we've been seeing then. North Korea, not following the launch of its rockets in the past, they usually go right into nuclear testing as well. Is this what we can expect this time around?
I think it's likely. I think it's more likely because the launch failed. I think that Kim Jong-un is now looking for a success, in contrast to the failure. So I think because the rocket launch failed, it makes a nuclear test more likely.
Right after the rocket launch, North Korea is trying to re-trigger talks with the U.S. Do you see that happening?
No, I do not. Not in any short term. Neither will there be any food aid. North Korea basically made a choice. It made a choice to go ahead with the rocket launch. There's a very high probability that it's going to go ahead with a nuclear test. I don't see the United States willing to have any open public diplomacy with North Korea under those circumstances. There is quiet diplomacy that goes on outside the spotlight from time to time, meeting of North Koreans and Americans, and messages passed. But I don't see the United States returning to any public diplomacy anytime soon.
I'm really curious to know your opinions on this report. I'm sure you've heard about it from the Mainichi Shimbun, reporting about Kim Jong-un making mentions to some of the top leaders in the Workers' Party, saying that perhaps a transition to capitalism and economic reforms is on the horizons for North Korea. How plausible do you see that?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't put a lot of credence on one report based on secret sources. These have not proved to be reliable oftentimes. But there's a really important issue here, which is the path of reform for North Korea. And I would make a strong argument that North Korea has only a limited amount of reform that it can carry out under the current security circumstances. In North Korea, they recognize their problems. They know they have problems producing food, and they know that they're falling further and further behind South Korea in their ability to produce goods and services for their people. But for the rulers of North Korea, the most important thing, apparently, by their behavior over the years, is not the well-being of the North Korean people, it's the survival of the regime. And too much reform puts the survival of the regime in doubt. In other words, a loosening up could lead to something like what happened in the Soviet Union, where all control is completely lost.
Especially right now with the new leadership.
Especially right now with a new leadership, and generally under the circumstances where you have a relatively hostile United States and North Korea kind of South Korea hanging over the North Korean regime. The North Korean fear that the United States and South Korea would exploit any opening up as a way to infiltrate Western ideas and infiltrate South Korean ideas in order to undermine the regime. So while everyone wishes for reform of the North Korean regime, it's not a good regime. I think we have to recognize that reform has to go hand in hand with progress on the security issues. As long as North Korea feels that it's fundamentally threatened by the United States and South Korea, and it feels like that deep down, despite some public statements, the policy preferences of the United States and South Korea are to replace the regime in North Korea, there's only a limited amount of economic and political reform that they can carry out. However, if the relations between South Korea and North Korea and the United States and North Korea were to improve, then I think more reform would be possible. So most people think reform North Korea first, then make progress in the Six-Party talks or in the security issues.
But not necessarily.
But I think there's a limit to the amount of reform that can be done until there is progress on the security issues.
So basically steps forward from both sides
Steps forward from both sides and on both issues.
Well, Professor Flory, thank you so much for your time today and providing your expert analysis and insight to this matter of North Korea, especially following the recent rocket launch.
I appreciate your inviting me.